Hello and welcome. In this training, we will be reviewing the elements that are included in the quarterly record review to ensure that we are all looking at and understanding the elements in the same way. We will talk about each element and what the expectations are, where to find them in the case record, and reference the same on the Excel spreadsheet template that you have been provided. Our goals for today are to go into more detail about what the expectations are for completing the quarterly record review so that we can have consistent use across the state, both across agencies and within. We will also reference the materials that have been developed and included in the updated version of the QRR Excel template that is being released for use beginning in July of 2023. For background context, it is important to know that we do not review every case that is created. Instead, we select a sample that is representative of the entire population of waiver participants. We do that using a 95% confidence level with a 5% margin of error. This is the most statistically valid sample we can use to be the most representative of the whole without looking at every case. ODA creates the sample set and shares that with partner agencies each quarter. When completing the review tool, you will have the option to rate each item as met, unmet, or not applicable. The response area of the tool and in the associated instructions reference document will be black, indicating that this is not an option for that review element. Typically, this is the case when the review element does not apply to the specific waiver. For example, tier levels only apply to the assisted living waiver, so this item would not be applicable to the passport waiver case review. Whenever you rate an element not met, that item should be remediated so that it can be met whenever possible. The second review should reflect the remediation of any unmet elements discovered during the first review. If it is not possible to remediate, the item should be rated as unmet. The reviewer can include an explanation if desired, but this is not required. Now that we understand the ratings, let's review each question and the expectations for each. Reviewers should be sure to look for clear evidence of the presence of each item. Reviewers should not make assumptions about the presence of an item based on knowledge of how the program operates. Evidence should be clear enough that another reviewer would make the same rating. The instructions companion document provides the same explanation for reviewers to refer back to when completing their reviews. Question 1 reviews the requirement that the enrollment agreement is completed and signed at least annually. Because the case management system does not allow for the storage of uploaded documents, you have two options for reviewing this element. Your first option is to view the case file that is kept separately as the source document, and if the agreement is present and signed, you can rate this element as met. Reviewers can note on the tool that the source documentation was viewed to assess this item. You also have the option to accept the case note documentation indicating that the agreement was reviewed, completed, and signed. The instructions document provides the same explanation for reviewers to refer back to when completing their reviews. The next review element deals with the requirement that each waiver participant be provided with an initial assessment and periodic review at least annually of the need for a level of care specified in the waiver. This documentation should be located in the case management system under the level of care assessment screen, but may also be supported through case note documentation. This review item is to include the caregiver input on the consumer's needs, their level of natural supports, and any respite needs, and will be situational depending on how the caregiver is impacted by the care needs of the consumer, as well as their involvement in the day-to-day life of the consumer. If the waiver participant does not have a primary caregiver, this item would be rated as not applicable. This information can be found in the case notes, the care plan, or in the assessments. For example, in the assessments menu under the informal support system screen, the documentation can go in the implications box. For this review item, reviewers are evaluating if the documentation provides information about how financial tasks are managed and by whom. When a waiver participant is independent in managing their financial tasks, this element is considered met. This information should be indicated in the care plan, but may also be found in the case notes recording the conversation about who will be managing finances. These next few review elements focus on participant or self-directed services. They will only apply to the passport waiver, so any assisted living waiver reviews will be marked as not applicable. This first review item reviews the documentation to ensure that a conversation was had with the individual about all their options for service delivery, including the option for participant-directed services. When the assessor or case manager have determined that an individual is not appropriate for the participant-directed option based on clinical assessment, that assessment and rationale should be documented. If the case manager or assessor documented that the individual was not appropriate for participant-directed services, but educated them on all other service options, this item would be rated as met. The focus of this review element is that documentation of the assessment that the individual was not clinically appropriate for the service option is present in the case file. For those individuals that are assessed as appropriate but declined, the documentation should reflect that decision. The option for participant-directed services is available statewide in the Passport program. The expectation is that it is presented as an option for all Passport consumers with the exceptions we have already noted. Assisted living reviews would note this element as not applicable. This review element focuses on the documentation that all needs identified in the initial and/or ongoing assessments are addressed in the clinical record. They may be funded through the waiver, or they may be supported by additional community resources. The expectation is that all needs identified during the assessment are identified on the care plan, have a corresponding service on the service plan. Services may be waiver services or community resources. Information may not be included in the care plan or the service plan, but it may be documented in the case notes. Waiver assurances require that service plans be updated or revised at least annually, or when warranted by changes in the waiver participant needs. When a change in the service plan is necessary, but no changes to the care plan are needed, clear documentation in the case notes should justify the need for changes. Information regarding changes may be located in various locations, such as case notes, care tools, care plan, etc., but must be consistent throughout the record to be able to mark this element as met. Services are expected to be delivered in accordance with the service plan, including the type, scope, amount, duration, and frequency specified in the service plan. Focus on identified patterns of failure to provide services that have potential to negatively impact consumer health and safety. Needs identified within the case record related to authorized services match the service plan. When discrepancies in services authorized and services provider exist, such as when there's a provider shortage, documentation should clearly demonstrate that the case manager is actively working to fill the service need gap. If the previous question, which is question 9 on the review tool, is unmet, the expectation is that the case manager took appropriate action to intervene and work with the consumer to resolve the issue. If question 9 is met, this review item is not applicable. The focus of this review element is to ensure that Medicaid payment rules are followed through the application of payer sequencing. The service plan should indicate the payer sequence for services, along with other information in the case record about services being provided to meet all identified needs of the consumer, whether they are waiver supported or through community resources. Appropriate payer sequence is as follows: commercial insurance, Medicare, Medicaid state plan, and then Medicaid waiver. The consumer does not have the ability to alter the payer sequence. If the provider of choice does not accept the available payer source, such as Medicaid state plan, the case manager may utilize waiver funding. Supporting documentation should be notated within the service plan, comments, case notes, and care plan. In the AL facility, the facility is the sole provider of services and is responsible for meeting the needs of the person. Case notes may focus on making the AL meet their responsibilities. Documentation in the case record should clearly show that the waiver participant was given free choice of providers. Documentation should be located in the case notes, indicating that the case manager discussed provider options and the consumer made an informed choice about what providers would provide services. Falls risk screenings should be completed for each consumer. The Falls risk assessment is located in the assessment menu under medical information in the Falls risk tab. Case notes and care plans should also include documentation of recommendations that were reviewed and offered. The documentation in the case record should indicate that the individual has a backup plan completed when appropriate, and the case record clearly indicates that backup plans are identified, feasible, and in place for services related to health, safety, and welfare. The criteria is focused on backup planning when a provider is unable to provide services, not the provider's required backup plan. The focus of this element is on health and safety related services. For services outside the scope of waiver-supported services, best practice is to ensure that the individual is aware of backup plans for all services. Tier assignment only applies to the assisted living waiver. Passport case reviews will have this item marked as not applicable. The care plan should clearly state the tier assigned and the related services provided. This information may also be found in the case notes. All waiver consumers are required to be provided with and educated on their state hearing rights at least annually. Case notes should clearly document this education. The expectation is that this is done not more than 1 year from the previous annual education. If any adverse action, such as a denial or decrease in waiver services occurs, it is required that the state hearing rights be provided to the individual again. Documentation should clearly indicate this and might be found in the case notes or in the JFS 4065 log in the case management system. The case manager will review with the consumer how to report abuse, neglect, exploitation, and other critical incidents at least annually, and will clearly document this education within the case notes. Upon notification of a potential health and safety risk, the care manager will complete a health and safety action plan, update the person-centered care plan, and case notes for ongoing review. If applicable, the care manager will report the incident to the Ohio Department of Aging via the incident management system. This review element focuses on the care plan and other clinical documentation to ensure that any known or perceived risks are being addressed if they have the potential to negatively impact the health, safety, and welfare of the individual. For this review element, the focus is on making sure that if an incident happens, it is reported in the incident management system. This will require the reviewer to access a system outside of the case management system to review the incident indicated in the case record was reported appropriately. If no incidents that meet the definitions outlined in Ohio Administrative Code 5160-44-05, this review item would be rated as not applicable. Continuing with the theme of incident management, this review element is looking to make sure that reporting timeframes were met when reporting an incident. This review will be done in the incident management system outside of the case management system. Again, if there were not incidents reported, this element would be rated as not applicable. Finally, if any incidents were reported, the case manager or other investigative entity should clearly identify that the root cause and/or contributing factors were identified and addressed. The care manager will work collaboratively with the consumer to ensure any perceived risks for future or repeated events are addressed. The care manager will create and update feasible interventions within the consumer's person-centered care plan, case notes, and health safety and action plan. Thank you for listening to the training information presented today. If at any time you have questions, you can reach out to the strategic review team. Thank you again.